Hey Mo,
Hey, Ricky.
the doctor is in.
We're in with a very special and important topic, I think. You know, there's so much focus, especially because you guys are in Chicago at ASCO, and the focus is on clinical research. It's on outcomes. It's on looking at the data. But there are different types of data, and it's important for our community of viewers and folks to understand what types of research and what types of data there is and how to interpret that in the context of all this explosion of science that's happening around us, you know?
Yep, and we have a very, very special guest, Dr. Lynn McCroy from Pfizer.
I don't know how special I am, but I'm happy to be here.
You're pretty special. You're hanging out with the cool kids tonight, and we're
I know.
glad to have you for
Yeah, my
sure.
social status has gone up just by being here. So thank you.
I know she did a great video for us at SABCS when we were doing
Mhm.
our TNBC roadshow with Melissa and Haley.
Yep.
She was so awesome. And so, we've been talking to Pfizer a lot. They're a great supporter of ours and just a great partner to work with. And so, we kind of had this conversation about how can we explain this different kind of science to our audience. And so that's why she's here and it's called real world data. So we know we talk a lot about clinical trials and getting clinical trial data, and we know that we don't have enough Black women in those clinical trials. And
Hmm.
so what happens when the drug gets to the world and people start taking it? And what happens then? And how do we measure the impact? So I'm not even going to try to define this. I'm going to pass it over
Well,
to my friend, Dr.
well,
Lynn.
Dr. Lynn, tell us a little bit about you and your background and tell us your why. Like, how did you get into this first? I always ask people that
Yeah.
question because I'm so curious to know a little bit of why this particular area of interest for you.
Sure. And well, I started out as a practicing surgeon. I went to medical school at the Medical College of Virginia, and I did my residency there in general surgery. And then I practiced for about 15 years. And what I was really interested in is trying to have an impact at a sort of a more of a population level. And I initially was interested in public health, but then I found there just weren't very many jobs in public health. And what jobs there were all sort of political appointees, or they were short grants. And it didn't look to me like it was a way for me to have a career that I could count on, because I thought it would be too much transition from one, if something's a fad for political reasons
Yeah.
and then it goes away and the funding goes away. And I just thought, what can I do beyond that? And I entered actually in the contract research field first, which is really how I learned about the opportunities for medical professionals in the drug development space, which I really didn't know anything about because medical school doesn't really teach you any of that.
Teach us that. You're
No.
right.
And so I had an opportunity to join a large pharmaceutical company, and I took an opportunity when Pfizer was first developing their CDK4/6 inhibitor. I jumped at the chance to join them because much of my practice had been taking care of patients with breast cancer. So it was an area of clinical work for me. And what I missed the most about my practice was those patients and talking to them, because I had relationships with them that lasted years and years. And I surprised myself because I thought I was going to miss actually operating, but that's not what I missed. I missed talking to
Mm.
those people who, I knew their kids and their grandchildren, and I'd been with them on a journey for a long period of time. And it was a real gap. And so when this opportunity came up for me to join Pfizer, it just allowed me to sort of close the circle and say, okay, well, now the passion I had about taking care of those people, I can now bring to helping them at a different level in a different way. So that's how I
Hmm.
ended up where I am. But real world evidence has become a very important part of what I do inside the organization, because when we were developing this drug, what you may not be aware of is, because this was an entirely new mechanism of action in the breast cancer setting,
Hmm.
actually got an accelerated approval for that drug on just a very small number of people who were in an early trial. And then, of course, we had to do a larger study to confirm the benefit. But there was only only a couple hundred people who were initially treated before that approval occurred.
Right.
Well, with that limited exposure, we are not going to have the full breadth of understanding of how that drug actually works especially in diverse patient populations, because those patients are often underrepresented in a study, never mind one in which only a few hundred people are enrolled.
So go back for a minute and
Sure.
explain the drug. Yeah,
CDK4/6
Yes,
inhibitor
yes.
now it's a class of drug that helps patients with metastatic HR positive, HER2 negative breast cancer. And it's been in the market now for 10 years. And there are 2 others in the class as well. So it's transformed the landscape for metastatic breast cancer patients with HR positive disease
Mhm.
A lot of women alive.
and given a lot of women opportunity to thrive and be able to seize the quality of life that's available to them and help them stay engaged with things that matter to them.
Right.
And those other drugs in the class, not just Pfizer's drug, but in the class as a whole, have also demonstrated those benefits. So I think it's been transformational.
Right.
But like I say, I think that the responsibility that we have is to understand what happens when that drug is in widespread use. So what we've seen over this past period of time is many hundreds of thousands of patients have gotten a prescription for this drug. We then want to understand what their experience of using the drug was in routine clinical care. And
Mhm.
obviously that information is not the same as a randomized clinical trial,
Right.
because that randomized trial can isolate different elements of a patient's condition, different elements of their cancer, and try to study the effect of the drug while we make those other things equal in each arm of the study. But in real life, that's not what happens.
Right.
People get prescribed a drug because of the combination of their own circumstances, their prior treatment, as well as their disease. So there's elements of bias based on those conditions. So it's not as if you're randomly assigned to a treatment in real life. You're getting the treatment you need that your doctor and you agree on.
Right.
So when we then get large samples of data from large numbers of patients who've been treated, we can balance those characteristics
Right.
and come up with information that complements what we've learned in the clinical trial. It doesn't replace it, because a clinical trial is designed to try to identify a causal benefit. In other words, can the drug work is what the randomized study can tell us.
Mhm. Mhm.
How is the drug working is partly what the real world data can help us understand. So when we
For a
collect that
way bigger audience
for
and,
bigger,
and in
So,
practical life situation, right? Yeah.
so causation, right? When we talk about, and I was actually in a focus group for Pfizer not too long ago, talking about this and how do clinicians understand and interpret, and what do we do, especially oncologists, what do we do with real world data? And the recurring theme was, well, you can't establish causality, right? You can't establish causation, and there's a little bit of almost an inferiority complex about real world data right now, unfortunately, but it is so importantly inclusive, right? Because when you think about clinical trials, Ricky, we always talked about how there's a bias because you're taking the healthiest of the sick, right? You want to reduce all the other things that could be what we call confounders, or things that can confuse an outcome. So you don't want somebody who's got stage 3 kidney disease and this and that and all these other things that could influence how the drug is working.
but of course,
But
those people have breast cancer.
Right. Right.
those
Or
are real life. Exactly. When you say
or
real world,
they're excluded from the trial because of
right?
diabetes
Yes.
or kidney disease or something else, or high blood pressure, which a lot of people have.
Yeah.
Right. So now we want to look at those and what happens in those individuals. Is it how do I say it? And not to put you on the spot, Doc, because I'm a huge fan of real world data, and I think we should be using and incorporating it more into actual clinical practice. It should be influencing care today. But is it fair, though, that the trials still aren't necessarily including those subsets of folks? You know what I mean? They get included on the how well is this drug working, but not actually in the is this drug curing, improving outcomes, improving overall survival? Like, how do we find the happy medium there, I guess?
Yeah. And that's a process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a rapid solve, but
Yeah.
there's no question it has to be part of what we work on. So we
Yeah.
have a responsibility also to try to make sure that our clinical trials include diverse patient populations, that patients have access, and that there is broad representation. How do we do that? It's a multifactorial process. It has to start even with our clinical trial design, right?
Mhm.
Do we design a study that has an appropriate burden for participation as opposed to something overwhelming that people just aren't even going to sign on to do?
Yep.
Then we've appropriately done that. We have to include the endpoints that matter to patients, not just endpoints that can get the drug registered. In other words, there are conditions in which something that helps us understand whether the drug can get a regulatory approval is one piece, but helping us understand what's the impact on the quality of life
Of the
of the
patient.
patient taking the drug
Very
isn't.
true.
So
Right.
it all has to be part of that picture. But to go back to the inequities that we see, basically, if we at Pfizer, we really took a hard look at how well were we doing when we create those studies and enroll
Mhm.
patients. And we found only about 1 in 4 of those clinical trials that we were doing had the representation that reflected the population at large and the epidemiology of the given disease.
Mhm.
We've created 5 different pillars that we operate under, trying to solve for these issues. And
So go back for a second. You
Yeah.
said 1 in 4 trials that you
that's just Pfizer trials, but if you
Pfizer
look more
trials, yeah.
broadly, if you look
Right.
at oncology,
Yeah.
it's even worse
It's even
than
worse.
that.
Yeah, it is even worse.
Mhm. Less
And
than 3%. Yeah.
Yeah, we've been working on this for over a decade in a real conscious way, but this is what we really have just identified more recently, trying to say, assessing our progress. Okay, well,
Right.
how are we doing?
Right.
And
Right.
still seeing such a gap. We know, look, that there are challenges even beyond, does a patient get offered an opportunity to be in a study? Then there are barriers to participation,
Right.
and there are actual challenges even with the patients being able to, even once they've decided, yes, I'd like to participate,
Mhm.
how do we make that possible?
You're right.
And there's a
Sure.
lot of things that we learned during the pandemic. And one
Yeah.
of those things were that trials don't always have to require somebody to go to a single centralized site.
Absolutely.
We can take the study to the patient, number one. And number two, we've learned that we can look at demographic information and information around communities and figure out what are the locations that are going to serve the population the best. And then how do we address obstacles? And of course, all of those solutions are local solutions, even though
Mhm. Mhm.
sort of there's usual
Right.
suspects, right, to the impediments. But that doesn't mean the usual problems are actually the ones that are causing a challenge in the local environment.
Right.
So you can't just have sort of a blanket approach that, well, gee, if we had hours, let's make sure we include hours after 4 o'clock. Well, okay, that's true, but that doesn't mean that's the real problem,
Right.
or transportation is the problem, or there are a myriad of issues, even things like a lack of understanding of what your rights are at your job,
Wow.
that
Okay.
you can get care.
At your
That,
job. Right.
yeah, and
Right.
so there's even employment law support that patients need to participate. So the challenges are a myriad of issues. How to
Mhm.
address them is, first of all, integrating all that in our thinking and our study design, our site selection, our enrollment strategies, and then partnering with
Mhm.
advocacy organizations, partnering with community organizations, trusted messengers
Like
within the
ours.
community,
Yeah. Yeah.
like you guys, and trying to make sure that we are working with you, not at you. I
Mhm.
think medicine unfortunately has a reputation of being a patronizing environment that is really somewhat tone deaf. And I think that's true in clinical practice, but it has also been true of the clinical trial environment.
Well, we know that's happening
Yeah,
to Black women. They're not being heard. They're being dismissed.
right.
They're not, and really the main reason why we're not participating in trials is because doctors don't invite us.
Exactly. And
And
this is
so-
also part of the problem is
Yes.
there is
But there
not.
are barriers even to that, to the why the doctors aren't offering the trials.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the doctors, if you just think about who are the doctors
Mhm.
don't
Mhm.
represent the communities.
Right. They don't.
And
They don't.
so you have somebody who doesn't look like you, who doesn't see you fully,
Right. Right.
and therefore they're not offering you the something they would offer somebody who looked like them.
Exactly.
And so there's implicit bias and unconscious bias that physicians don't even recognize, And of course, we also don't do a good job of
Mhm.
with this in training, right?
Right.
This is something that isn't
Very true.
and not adequately managed in our professional
Right.
lives.
Well, I think also like you and Mo are different, not your typical doctors. You know what I mean? I think that,
Yeah, but
you
why
guys-
is that? Right.
yeah,
Right,
well,
right.
you tell
We
me.
should be.
I
But
know,
this is what I'm
but you
saying.
guys aren't. And so I think what you bring to the party in the conversation is a lot of love and care. And not that most doctors don't care, but,
I think
um,
we take really seriously though the need for trusted messengers in all of these spaces and the need to connect these dots, right? Because by the time we're at the point of offering a patient a trial, there's some things that needed to have happened. There's a trust relationship that needed to
Yes.
have happened.
yeah,
There's some innovation. There's some opportunities at the leadership level in our institutions to even be able to offer that trial. There's some forethought that goes into trying to be knowledgeable about what trials are available and what patients are the most eligible and appropriate for it. And you know, doctors get bogged down.
yes,
Systematically.
you do.
Yeah.
You have to
Right.
happen. You
Yeah.
have to want for it to happen.
Intentional. You got to be intentional about it. One of the things I love that you're saying, Dr. McRoy, is you know, talking about how these drugs impact people in real time in real life. Because one of the biggest complaints that we all sort of have about trials is the fact that it takes 15, 10 years, longer than that, to really see the results of clinical trials done today. And even patients will say, well, that's going to impact people 10 years from now. How's this going to help save my life? How's this going to impact me now? And understanding what metrics we can look at and what type of data we can glean from studies like real world trials and real world data helps us to answer those questions a lot sooner, because innovation is happening. You know, this is precision oncology, but if we're waiting 10, 15, 20 years for some outcomes and some data, it's moving too slow, and
Well,
it creates some churn and mhm,
and one of the ways real world evidence can actually help us with in
mhm,
the oncology space specifically is we
mhm.
can construct control arms out of historical information from real world evidence.
So explain that to our
Yeah.
people. What's a control arm?
So
Yeah.
if you're doing a randomized clinical trial, you're assigning, you and me are both enrolled, let's say. You're
Right.
going to get randomly assigned to one
One
treatment.
drug,
I'm going to
okay.
get randomly assigned maybe to the same one or maybe the control arm.
But both of
the
them are,
control
both
arm-
of them are treatments and both of
Yeah.
them work on
And-
cancer.
right.
There's no sugar
And
pills.
No sugar pills. And the
Right,
thing
right.
that people, I think, largely don't realize is that the control arm is at the least the best standard of care available.
Right.
Because
Say that again,
otherwise-
Doc. Say that again.
Yeah, so I think people think, oh my God, it's going to be an experiment and it might not work, and then what?
Right.
However, the fact is the control arm is the best available treatment and it's being compared.
Exactly.
That may add benefit.
It may be better.
It might
Right.
be better.
And that's the crux of, and that's the most misunderstood thing about clinical trials.
I
is
think
that
so.
I think I'm going to get something
It's,
that's
think of it as a last option, but in
Yes.
fact, it should be one
the
of the
best,
first,
the first,
because you're going to get, at the minimum, you're going to get the best
best.
available
the
option.
best care.
And
Yeah.
you're going to get a lot more support than you might have
Yes.
otherwise. And people who are micro managing and
Right.
engaged
And
with
taking
you.
better care of you.
Because they
closer
want to know
care-
every little thing.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
because they want you to stay on the study
Right.
to help make sure the study gets completed. And
Right.
so there's two parts to my answer about the time it takes to develop a drug. One is we have to design the study so people will participate, number one, but then once they're enrolled, they have to stay enrolled. So
Right.
that means you start doing it and all of a sudden it's too much of a pain that you're having a side effect. If we don't manage and support you through that experience and help you understand what to expect, you're going to drop out and say, look, this is too much.
Too much for me.
yeah.
Right. Right.
Then the other side of it is, how do we make sure that enrollment happens quickly? Let's say we open a study and we want to enroll 500 patients, but hardly anybody knows about it or it isn't being offered.
Right.
Well, that's where community engagement, advocacy engagement,
That's where I come in.
where you come in it, but also being smart about where we are setting
Yeah.
up sites,
Yeah.
centralizing trials,
Yeah.
making it possible for you to participate. Even tell me how you're feeling with your IFO, right?
Right.
You don't have to come in and fill out a form in front of the nurse
Right.
to
You
answer
could
the
do it at home.
question.
Yeah. Yeah.
So all those things can help, but then real world evidence can also help us because we can construct control arms and maybe have fewer people assigned to the standard of care and more people assigned to the experimental drug so the data gets available faster. We can also help predict with, now we have opportunities using artificial intelligence even to model drugs that can help us be more accurate in our drug design,
That's
have
awesome.
less side effects, because that's the other side, the other trouble. We have therapy available for patients, but oftentimes the treatment can cause trouble. So
Mhm.
how do we design drugs as cleanly as possible to mitigate or reduce the
side
chance
effects,
you're
right.
going to have a side effect?
Okay.
Part of it's even in the design of the molecule. So honestly, at an inflection point with the combination
Mhm.
real world evidence, the tools we have at our disposal, and are just even just being able to have these conversations and face where the problems are, right?
Right.
As opposed
Talk
to
more.
ignoring it.
Yeah. This is
Talk,
so,
talk more about AI in this space and how AI is being used, because I think there's a couple of different ways that we're seeing AI be incorporated as a tool, hopefully for health equity. For example, I'll give you one really good example that I was reading an article about recently, which is that we have the ability to identify where are the largest pockets of eligible, let's say African Americans, Hispanic Americans, whatever, for a trial, and AI is helpful to be able to figure out, where to direct recruiting efforts. But, tell us a little bit more about how you all are incorporating AI into some of the work that you're doing.
Well, that's a perfect example. And actually, at Pfizer, we developed a diversity center of excellence to try to help make sure we're considering sort of a 360 view of how do we address inequities. And one of them is using information to model demographic information, community information, and disease reporting. So many people may not even be aware that a cancer diagnosis is often part of a registry, right? Whether it's a federal
Right.
registry with the center or with the SEER and Medicare, which is an epidemiology
what does
registry.
that mean? To
It-
explain that to.
It just means that our government, our health system
Mhm.
wants to understand who's getting
Who's
what
has
cancers,
cancer,
at
right.
what ages, how do they do, what are their
Right.
outcomes, they get treated. There's
And that's
also
how we talk about some of the numbers that we talk about.
exactly,
How
it's
many
how
women
we
are
know.
getting cancer. Yeah, so that's a
Exactly.
place, right?
Yeah. So we have information that previously we just weren't connecting the dots of like, okay, well, let's look at who's affected, who lives in what communities. How do we figure out where should we go to find investigators who can help make sure those patients get enrolled?
Right.
It's not just, hey,
Mhm.
we're at site B, there's the population is there. We got to have the right investigator who's connected in those environments and communities.
Sure.
Then we got to really have the
Right.
partnership we're talking about, and we got to map it out. It has to be systematic and thoughtful. It can't just be, okay, well, these are our usual friends who know who we know can conduct a trial. It has to be
The
a
right
real
people.
That's
systematic.
exactly what I was just going to
Yeah.
ask you. Because one of the limitations of AI is that it will reward the places that are rich and saturated already. So the rich get richer. And one of the issues in diversity in trials is fostering talent, right? New investigators who want the opportunity to be funded to recruit and to set up their research centers also. And so I love hearing this, because what I'm hearing you say is that you're working around one of the ways that AI can perpetuate bias. Right, because
Exactly.
there's a bias that can happen where you only give it to the NIH centers that have always gotten, at
Right.
least 3%, at least 5%, 10% into trials. But what about those young new investigators at a time when the research dollars are really struggling, and mentorship and sponsorship is necessary? So this is exciting to me to hear you say that we're being
Yeah.
thoughtful about working around some of these biases and limitations to make sure that we're being inclusive, not just in our patient population, our trials, but in our investigators, in our sites,
Now,
in our
right.
locations.
Yeah, and I
Mhm.
think the other link to that is involving the community that's
Yes.
affected. Right?
Absolutely.
It's getting away from the paternalistic approach and recognizing that nobody has more to gain than the population who's affected with this disease.
Yep.
Right.
Those patients have a huge amount to contribute, involving them in reviewing protocols, involving them in helping us understand, okay, well, if this study's asking you to get a CT every 6 weeks, will you be able to do that? The answer is going to be no for
No.
most people,
Right.
right?
Enough
Or
time.
or, do you really need a pregnancy test every 2 weeks in this study, right? Hello, that doesn't make
Right,
sense.
right.
So, these things sound obvious when you talk about them in this context, but when we're designing a protocol, you're trying to eliminate things that could potentially confound the finding of the study. Well, yes, the drug showed this, but in fact, 90% of the people had this other condition or they were predisposed for that reason. So you're trying to eliminate those
Right,
confusing factors. Well, sometimes when you do that, you make these knee-jerk assumptions that you can't have anybody whose kidney function is marginally not
right,
good. But in fact,
Huh?
this is metabolized in the liver. There's no reason you have to exclude those people.
right,
But it requires you to think each study is an individual process. You have to start from the disease. What are
Mhm.
you trying to prove? Where are the things? And you create exclusions only based on evidence that that the drug could
It's gonna make a
actually
difference,
impact the
right.
kidney. So you're not going to include people with kidney disease.
And you could be leaving out a lot of people who have
Mhm.
these,
Would to be
who
left
don't
out.
going to be left out,
Yeah,
right? So
but
this
but
is a
but
way better
routinely they
chance,
have been left
right,
out. So therefore you sort of perpetuate the whole thing.
right,
It's just like saying you're going to only go to the NCI center. Well, you keep doing that and eventually you make sure that's all you can do, right?
right,
Because you eliminate those other people.
right.
They're not going to be around
They're not going to be
because
in
you
that
didn't give
center,
them the
right,
nurturing to
right,
be able to continue.
And Ricky, to the question that you raised earlier about, sort of the difference in clinicians, I think recognizing that paternalistic approach is no longer really the most effective and viable and sustainable model for how we practice cancer care anymore, right? Like that to me, I think is a hallmark of a clinician who has insight and self-awareness because they're recognizing that I need the input and the partnership of the patients of the community. And it's not just walking in saying, I'm going to do this, 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 and hands on the doorknob and we're out of here. But it's sitting at eye level and it's saying, what do you
Taking it,
understand?
yeah,
What do you
Well, and
believe?
or
What's
what
important
are
to
your
you?
goals?
what are
Yeah.
your goals?
Yes. What's
You
important to you and what are your goals? Yeah.
on out this treatment,
Right,
what
Mm-hmm.
what's your relative value on X versus Y? If you get this treatment and it has this risk, maybe that's something you're not willing to take, but you are willing to do something different because your objectives might not be the same.
and
Sure.
frankly, to be able to even have that conversation with your doctor
Right.
Yep.
is important to be able to say, hold on, this isn't for me.
And this is also why community education and understanding is
Yes.
so fundamental because for better or for worse, we all are responsible for our own
Mhm.
health. We all have to take ownership that if I'm not advocating for myself, I can't assume somebody else is.
Right.
So yes, it is a burden in the sense that you have to then do some work on your side, but just like you have to do work every day to say, okay, well, I am going to eat vegetables. I don't like broccoli, but I'm
Right,
eating
I'm
it,
gonna eat
right?
it.
I'm not going to smoke, even though, I've enjoyed
Right,
that feeling. Well, you're making those decisions all day, every day. Well,
Yep.
this has to be looked at the same way.
right,
I've got a condition. I have to take ownership of my role in making sure I get what I need to address it. So you have to, it doesn't mean you have to know the answers, but you have to be willing to ask the questions.
ask the questions and we are asking questions. I think for Black women, we just don't have data. We just don't have enough data and for any, even
Yeah.
for this, getting the screening guidelines right. And so
And that's why the real world evidence can help.
can help because
Because
if we
there
didn't
are-
get it in the trial, we can get it now.
Yeah.
Can you
And so
speak
you
to
can
that?
say, well, we've done some studies and looked at what happens for Black women who take one of these drugs. Do their outcomes look like the rest of the people who participated in the clinical trial,
Right.
or even the rest of the people in the real world data set?
Right,
Do they
Mhm.
derive a similar level of benefit, or are we seeing something different?
right,
Or do we see a more common side effect?
right.
Right.
All those are things that you find out in
In the real world
the
data.
real world, and that's a
So let
very
me ask you this.
Yeah.
Getting to the sort of the practice changing power of real world data, how do we convey that message to clinicians, particularly, and I think, surgeons and breast surgeons, we're early adopters and we're all about, learning what works in the now in order to impact change for the future. But some of our oncology colleagues are a little bit more, let me see the backstory and the data. Let me see the longitudinal data. I want to see the,
Right.
sort of the long range. How do we invite them to the table to understand this in ways that can help change practice sooner than later?
Yeah, and I think it's neither one or the other. It's
Right.
both.
It's
And
all of the above.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
Right.
It's totally also
Yes.
recognizing that there is a full picture of any of these treatments, and an isolated piece of information doesn't give you what you need to
Right.
know. So
Mm-hmm.
these things are complementary, not duplicative. And so we have to think about them as, I have this information that helped me understand what can the drug do. I have this information that's telling me what is happening in a certain population, in a certain landscape. Then obviously you have to integrate that and say, okay, with Ricky who's in front of me, these are the pieces of information that help me understand what's she likely to get out of this experience.
Mm-hmm.
What's likely to happen based on the information I know. And sometimes I'm not going to have the
All the
specific data I
information.
need.
Yeah.
So then and that's life as a practicing doctor. You then
Right.
have to extrapolate and try to understand either from your own experiences with patients like Ricky or from patients who are represented in clinical trial data and or real world evidence to put the picture together. It's a whole picture. It's not one piece of data supersedes. You have to be holistic to integrate the information and then understand what you're looking for out of that treatment.
Right. And the real world data gives you that information to be able to
Help you put it
help you
together.
put it together.
But
to
but I
tell the
think
story.
I think like many things that we've touched on today, I don't think physicians, especially in oncology, have a very robust understanding of how to determine what's rigorous real world information versus something that perhaps is anecdotal
Anecdotal or
and not
story.
something you can really
Really measure
understand.
and understand.
Yeah, like for example, do we know, is there a comparator arm? Do we understand what's the relative benefit? It's not just, okay, this drug had that outcome, but well, what happened to people who got something else?
Right.
So I can put it in context in the real world. In a randomized trial, there's typically a control arm, not 100% of the time, but typically there is. So you have context and you can compare. Sometimes real world information, there may not be context. You might not have the information to make relative sense of things.
Right.
But when you can look at that information and try to understand what population does it represent, were
You
the
kind of see
appropriate
trends.
statistics
Yeah.
applied? We have to help oncologists have the tools to dissect the real world information to say, hey, is this rigorous? Was it designed to look at this question? Is it a data set that's fit to answer the question?
Mm-hmm.
Did they declare how they were going to analyze it from the front end, or did they change after they saw what it showed? All of these things can mislead us. And so we have to have an educated population looking at the information. And oncology has not been an area
Doing that
where
for
real
us.
world was
Right.
used very much because the patient populations are smaller and it's harder to get the information out of the
Mm-hmm.
patient. Some diseases like cystic cardiovascular disease, you can get information from billing claims that tell you yes or no, did an outcome happen? For example, did someone have a stroke? Well, there's a billing code related to that.
Right.
Did somebody have a bleeding side effect? There's billing codes. So you can look at thousands of people. In oncology, there aren't billing codes for did the tumor respond? Did the patient
Okay.
progress?
There's a billing code for the kind of cancer it is, but not.
But
the
not
level of
Now there is.
Yeah. Right. But
Now, yeah.
so how does a patient, like, what do our patients need to know? Like,
They
how
should
do they
ask-
approach this?
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to what questions to ask.
Yeah.
So again, they shouldn't have the burden of knowing the answer, but they should
Mhm.
have responsibility to ask the question and make sure they understand. Doctor, for this treatment, were patients like me in the clinical trial?
Got it. And when the doctor says, no, there weren't,
Or they've
Mhm.
said, not enough. of
not
them,
enough,
Not
right,
enough of them. And they
right.
say, well, do you have any other information that helps you
Know that
make
this
a
works,
decision
yeah,
about
right.
what's your recommendation for
right.
me? Are there other pieces of information that can help you answer?
I think it's important for patients to ask
Yeah.
questions about, when you ask questions about trials or, because I what I've learned from even being a part of Touch for the last, how many years now? 5 years almost?
Yeah, Four.
Four going on 5, right? Like
Going
for
on
there from the
5, we're
beginning,
going on
right?
5, we're getting
It
there.
is is that patients and advocates are desiring to be involved. They're literally signing themselves up for clinical trials. And in that conversation, there needs to be a discussion about all of the different types of trials. And so, understanding that there are trials looking at measuring some of these real world outcomes, right? And looking at response to and adverse events because of, and there's so many different ways to think about this that I think opening and expanding our minds about what a trial is and how it can help is a takeaway that I hope advocates would begin to wrap their minds around. Just like understanding there's trials in surgery, there's trials in radiation, there's trials in medications, and they're not, again, less than the standard of care, but these trials are designed to look at how this is impacting people like you right now. And
Exactly.
that's a take home
There's
message.
much
Like, this is
faithfulness.
me and my family,
Yeah,
my
I've been to a
community.
few of those.
Yeah.
So go back to one thing we talked about earlier. So we have this opportunity to measure how a drug is performing in the real world. So that's something that I can use as an advocate to say, you know what? You should definitely take this drug because in real world data is showing that Black women do well on this drug.
Or that even though, let's say in the trial, there were 5% of the participants were Black,
Right,
but when we look at patients of color who
Are taking the
in real
drug.
life are taking it, we're seeing that they also have a benefit, which is consistent with what was seen in the trial.
Right.
For the whole population.
for the whole population.
So there's no reason to feel that
Right.
it won't benefit me
Right,
as a woman of color. I have every reason to anticipate I'll derive benefit just as a clinical trial represented, as opposed to thinking, well, we don't know.
we don't know if it's gonna
anymore,
work
we
or
don't
not.
know.
Yeah, and we're seeing that, Doc, we're seeing that so much where, well, even when I took TAC, it was the cocktail for breast cancer, it didn't work. My cancer came back. And so to be able to say that, we know that some drugs aren't working on Black women, that's why our mortality rates are crazy. So to be able to have a story that this drug is performing in the marketplace, women are thriving on this. That's a great fit for me to be able to tell our patients.
Yeah.
You know,
And we also don't want to paint the picture that, anybody's thriving with cancer.
Right.
But, bottom line is what we want people to understand is there are other sources of data that
right,
can help us understand what's happening
right,
with somebody treated routinely. And that, of course, there are many people who do quite well. And of course,
Right.
there are people who don't,
right.
just as in the clinical trial.
Trial, but,
So the important thing is it's a whole picture.
right,
It
and we can
isn't
tell a
one or the
story,
other.
and we can tell a
you
story.
put all that together and
Yeah.
then help your doctor understand what your hopes are.
Mhm.
And that doctor then helps you arrive at a decision.
Right,
But the most important thing is for each patient to feel the right and responsibility to ask those questions and feel empowered to help make those decisions.
and that's the hard
Not
part,
feel like they're doing something wrong or they're challenging
the system or
the
whatever, yeah.
system. Yeah.
But that's the hard part because we're scared
Yeah.
and we don't feel like we know the answer, so we rely on you, the doctor, to say, here are the things that, and so, but I think when you present the information in a way that in words they can spell, like you're doing that. So thank you so much for that. And then we add the voice of trust of advocacy, we can get them where, to a
And
good
just
solution.
encourage the questions and
Yeah.
engage and,
Right.
think about it just like you would other decisions you're making
Right.
about your
Right,
health.
that's right.
It's scary. There's no question it's scary and it's intimidating. And then you also always feel on your back foot. Okay, this guy knows, therefore I can't ask a question, but that guy doesn't know you.
Right.
And
And what you've been through.
yeah, and
Right.
so, that's, you gotta own that and be willing,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it is, and to your point, is we do have to step up as patients and
Yeah,
play a
don't
role
feel
here.
guilt,
Don't
don't feel
feel
like, oh my
guilty,
God,
yeah.
like, okay, he's not gonna like it if I ask, whatever.
Right.
Well, if she doesn't like it, you need to find the next guy. 'Cause
Right. Right. Well, and I think that's what it becomes. It becomes a time conversation.
I know.
How much time will the doctor really spend with me? I mean, like Mo and you probably spend hours with whatever it takes with your patient. And what we're seeing is he's got his hand on the doorknob
Yeah.
before we can even get the list of questions out.
Right.
So I think that's sort of,
And to be fair, the system puts those pressures
Yes.
in place.
yeah.
It isn't necessarily that
Very true.
not
Right,
engaged
right.
or doesn't want to know. But unfortunately, our system doesn't reward that.
Right.
And
You
so
got a quota.
it's a balancing act. And we're
Right.
also in an environment today, we're very fortunate. There are typically patient portals. There's other ways to submit questions. You can also come in with your own list and say, look, I know we're not gonna have time to talk about all this. I'm gonna leave it with you or leave it with your nurse. Here's the top thing that's on my mind. And can you email me or can I follow up through the portal? In other words,
Great
there's
idea.
tools, there's more tools. And
That's a
so
great
True.
idea,
Yeah.
though. Good idea.
But
when
it
the doc-
starts with understanding enough to have those questions or have that advocate with you. And I think this is the power and the importance of advocacy groups as well, because the health literacy has to start before the diagnosis. Otherwise, you're sitting there and you're a deer in headlights and you're just trying to catch up to everything as opposed to asking these sorts of nuanced questions or having the forethought to say, you know what, I got my list. We only got the 3 and I'm going to, circle back with the navigator. And so I think, making sure that people feel prepared with the tools that you provide on like the Touch site and some of the other, advocacy group sites is really important so that you can come armed with enough information about even understanding your diagnosis, understanding hormone receptors, understanding the different modalities of treatment, because I feel like that's another challenge and a reason why sometimes trials don't always happen. They don't always transact because we may mention it, but you're trying to wrap your mind around 30 million other things. And it's like, not right now. I can't even get there.
Can't even address that.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And there has to be, I think, a more intentional way of coming back to that conversation, because it's very much, at least in the community hospitals like mine, it can be a little catch as catch can, like, oh, we'll circle back to that. But if my navigator, if my trial coordinator doesn't come back and say, hey, listen, so-and-so might be eligible for this. Did you talk to them? And the nurse will say, yeah, we put a pamphlet. Yeah, but did we have that conversation again?
Talk to them.
Right? Like putting some accountability in place and some checks and balances to make sure that that conversation happens more than once is also a really important thing that we should figure out a way to really encourage that second conversation about, about trials in particular.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, that's how we have Val too, we just
Mhm.
launched Touch Care, so we now have a 24/7 800 line for a navigator.
Awesome.
Mhm.
And so when you guys go home, we can get the calls and say, and basically Val gives hugs and kind of gets them to the next morning. And it's usually not clinical. It's usually something emotional, like even understanding an informed consent or
Yeah.
just explaining the treatment to their families. But at least we provide that service as an advocacy group to patients. So
And we also, Pfizer also has a website and an app called This is Living With, it's called Living With,
Mhm.
Living with
it's
Cancer.
great.
And it's really
It's
sort
really
of
a great
trying to be
app.
a clearinghouse for information. It's
Yeah.
a resource.
Yeah.
And there's also a clinical trial navigator system that Pfizer has, obviously for
Yes.
Pfizer trials. And these are all ways to try to help mitigate some of these challenges. But obviously it means you have to, first of all, be looking for the information.
Right.
Well, if you don't know, you don't know,
If you don't even know that it's out there to look for,
then
yeah,
you're not looking
Right.
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 And actually, that's one of the biggest challenges is
yeah,
if we aren't seeking information, we don't have a way to get it.
right.
Right.
And that's also where we can come in.
Yeah.
We'll see, because we direct people to your website all the time and say, this is
Yeah.
how to look for the information. So that's part of our deal too,
Yeah.
So,
And then just also recognizing, it's progress, not perfection. Every day we're trying to,
I love
ma-
that.
trying to-
Progress, not perfection.
That's
take-
right. That's right.
taking another step and persisting and having grit to make sure we're navigating as Pfizer the best we can to improve the way we operate.
Mhm.
A lot of people may not know that doctors work at pharma companies. What
Yeah.
a concept. And I
Mhm.
think they bring a heart to
Yes.
to the work that, the scientists don't necessarily bring.
And
Right.
I'll tell you, I got my first start as a summer intern in college. I was, I think, a freshman going into my sophomore year, and I worked at Pfizer in Groton, Connecticut,
Wow.
in the neuroscience lab. And it solidified my interest in and commitment to clinical research and to translational research. I ended up getting a master's degree in molecular biology and working at Fox Chase for five or 6 years or so.
So-
even before med school. And it's largely in part due to the pipeline program and the research that I was able to do at Pfizer. Groton was incredible and such a cool place I think I played in the Pfizer orchestra. There was like an orchestra there, and I was a trumpet player. And so, really great.
Player too. I knew you played piano.
Oh yeah, I was a trumpet player at Florida A&M, and they had through the Howard Hughes program. I ended up doing a summer at Pfizer. Oh man, lifetime
good.
ago.
Yeah,
Wow, wow, wow.
right. Well, I
wow.
started as a child, so
Yeah, see,
I'm
You
not as
did.
old as
it's all that to say that Pfizer's not new to this. They're certainly true to this. And I'm looking at this 175 on the
Yeah,
banner belt there. Talk
175
about the
years.
175 before we wrap up and get ready to go.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the 175th, huh?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's a humbling thing to be part of an organization that has such a legacy and has made such contributions during that 175 years.
Yeah.
And I'm just proud to help represent hopefully the future as we go forward and continuing to make those contributions. And I think one of the things that we're most proud of is Pfizer has never shied away from trying to tackle some of the toughest problems that man is facing. And so cancer is one of the things we've really
Mhm.
set our sights on
Yeah.
and have a dedicated commitment to advancing the ways that we can help patients with cancer and developing breakthroughs that change patients' lives. And
Yeah.
one by one, we're also doing our best to make sure those breakthroughs reach all the patients so that everybody has an opportunity to get optimal care no matter who they are or where they are.
That's awesome.
Yeah, well,
That's
there you
awesome.
go. That's it.
And you guys have been an incredible partner
Yeah.
for, our team. Katrina and Selena and Angela, they're all,
Sounds like a band, doesn't it?
I know,
Very
right?
fun.
And
Yeah.
Angela, yeah, we love them so much. They give us love all the time. So we're so grateful, and we're so grateful to have you today.
My pleasure.
So how can
Absolutely.
people reach out? They can always find you through me because, I always find
Yep.
everybody.
And
But send
also,
us that link again you were telling us about.
Yeah,
yeah, I will do that. I
Yeah.
will we'll give you the link and you can
we'll put it in,
Put
we'll put in the
out,
comments. We'll put
yeah,
the link in
definitely.
the comments. Okay, great. And we'll put, really all the Pfizer resource in the comments, so everybody can have them.
Okay.
Even the clinical trials link and everything. But I think this whole real world data is something that we all need to be learning about and talking about, and we'll keep talking about it. So thank you for this introduction. And we know that, we're seeing these drugs work. And give life and love and days and time, and weddings and babies, and
Yeah, it's an exciting time,
it's a
really.
It
great
is.
thing.
And it's an opportunity to get involved even now and to not say I wasn't included, but to really be included in the research that is going to influence outcomes eventually, but it's going to change how we administer drugs, how often. It's going to manage side effects better. It's going to really give us important data now that's going to help our community. So there's a role for us, and there's a way for us to get involved in clinical research, and real world evidence is part of a really important movement, I think, in precision oncology, especially. So everybody should be learning about it, asking your doctors about it, challenging, doing the research, and getting involved in it, because it is definitely here to stay.
Yep, and we're happy to answer whatever questions. You guys know how to reach us, Ricky at
That's it.
touchpoint.org. So thank you, Doc.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you so
Great to
so
have
much.
Thank you so much. I know we had a
Well,
great.
All right.
We hope it's been relatable and reliable and real. It's what we do every Wednesday night here on blackdoctor.org. We're thankful to our partners, our sponsors, and thankful to all of you for watching. And
Right.
we'll see you next time. The doctor's in.
The doctor's in, and to Pfizer. Bless you, love.
There it is.
See you soon. Love you,
See
Mo.
ya. Love you too. Give everybody my love there at ASCO. Tell them I'll see them next time, and I'll be at San Antonio. I think I'm moderating a panel and doing some fun things. So I look forward to meeting you when I get there. Okay.
Oh, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Take good care.
See you
Okay,
next
bye.
week.